well known in Bitcoin circles, but this podcast is sort of bridging the Bitcoin community with the spiritual community. So my first question, how would you present yourself to a spiritual audience that maybe haven't heard so much about your Bitcoin references?
I guess I would just tell them I'm a seeker of truth as well, that I know the journey takes some people deep on the inside of the pursuit of truth, and it takes some people deep on the outside. And for me, I suppose it's an approach from the outside, but I think the deep contemplation and meditation upon the question of what is truth and what is value really is what has brought me to Bitcoin and keeps me in Bitcoin, because I'm very committed to the idea that there is truth in this world, and that we can find that horizon shared between us where we can find firm truths. And that's what brought me to Bitcoin, is that I believe that only a world where we do have a form of money that doesn't have at its very base kind of guile and lies and deception, only through a form of common wealth like that are we going to be able to start creating the radical and sustained change that we need in the world, if we want to both heal the very real physical issues going on in the world, but to also heal our spirits and, the very devastating consequences of what it's meant to live in a world with only fiat money for the last century.
Yeah, that was a good introduction, because it is truth that is central to both Bitcoiners and spiritual people. It's just one tend maybe to be more looking at the external world, and one tend to be more looking at an internal world. And then, so if both of these communities look for truth, and truth is one and the same, then they should merge at some point.
Yes, that's how I see it. And not to say that coming up to that merging is, it is a monumental task in and of itself that requires deep seeking and consideration and contemplation and faith to make that leap in many places. But I think ultimately that's one of the things that I find the most exciting, is this idea of the inside world and the outside world sort of touching at this point. And I think it's pretty interesting to take that viewpoint as well, because in a lot of ways, Bitcoin is this manifestation of a non-physical method of protocol and communication, and it's all has non-physical features that create a represented object that's supposed to be physical. And this is one of the things I still think about quite frequently, is what is with these tensions of opposites that Bitcoin seems to bring about. Because I would think anybody from the spiritual community who's unfamiliar with Bitcoin would find it to be the strangest thing that you could have a show that's more focused towards spirituality and the inner world, with what I think on its face is seemingly almost like the most non-spiritual thing that there could be, like money. Like it's almost insulting to be like, one could have a show about that. And again, that's one of the things I find so fascinating about it, is that as people dig deeper, it starts to reveal itself with like, oh yes, of course it would show up in this way.
Yeah. And this embracing of opposites in the spiritual arena, this is happening when you're moving from the rational, then, which lives in duality, and you're moving into heart space where things merge. It's like from duality, where everything is black or white, God and the devil, and then when you go inside and you come into the heart, it's like, oh, God and the devil is the same, two sides of the same coin. Is this the kind of duality you mean?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you use that metaphor of God and the devil there, because I think for particularly more heady people that haven't spent time trying to connect to their heart in that. Like, again, this can seem like it, like some people could say that Bitcoin is God and that fiat is the devil, not for what they actually are, but insofar that Bitcoin represents a presentation of a form of the truth, and the devil represents this sort of guilefulness that, that represents the devil. And I think it's with deep consideration we start sort of seeing how these things link up, and like with the most recent market crash, I find it interesting how panicked people are. And I personally love it because, like if this is what we need to do in order to allow for the resonation of truth of what Bitcoin is and how it functions, particularly against all the other garbage that's going on out there, so be it. But, Bitcoin continues to plug along and do the exact same thing that it's been doing the whole time. Just the numbers around how people look at it has changed. And I very much appreciate it. It highlights and presents where and why people are here for it. And I've found, at least for myself in my circles, I really enjoy bear markets because people aren't, whoever is here to be working on Bitcoin and to help build what we are building, they seem to understand that price signal, while it's important, it's very much noise, and that taking out these day-to-day observations towards the price and its importance, and looking farther past towards, well, what is the actual nature of this money that we've been given to care for, and not to care for to accrue for ourselves, but to care for the future ones, and how the future is going to be able to approach money and wealth. So I think it's only with deep consideration that we can start taking these ideas that seemingly on their face are almost diametrically opposite, but once you consider and contemplate them more, you start to see how the puzzle pieces fit together to make it a single holistic piece.
Yeah. So if we dive into this a little bit, then if we have good and evil, and we say Bitcoin is good and fiat is evil. But another perspective of the same thing is I like to think of humans as nodes on the creation network, right? So you have the Bitcoin network, and then you have all the nodes, and they're active and they're supporting each other. And humans then have a node. Their soul is like a node. So when they connect to their soul, then they come online on the creation network, and they start to work together unconsciously, sort of, and their actions is sort of helping each other because they act in alignment with their soul. And then I see, if we look at the world, then it's like a war between those who wants to awaken people's nodes. They want to put them online. They want them to be, good to go. And that's like self-sovereignty, decentralization, and people's expression, free will, and free speech. And then you have the other side, what I would call evil. Then in this case, it is time, where they want to deactivate nodes. So they want to shut them down. They want people to conform. It's centralization, it's control, it's brainwashing, and that's the game happening right now. It's like a war of the souls, if the souls are able to become active or if they should be deactivated. Can you relate to that analogy?
Yeah, I appreciate that analogy because instead of saying they're trying to deactivate the nodes, I would actually say that they're connecting up to malicious nodes that are actually feeding them false data. And they're taking in that false data as being the real data and going out in the world and interacting with that in such a way. And that's why this action of questioning and contemplation is so important, is because those who are connected up to false nodes that are giving them misinformation can observe that information, find the actual errors in it. And once they find those errors, they can then start seeking, well, okay, so if money and savings is this thing that the state is supposed to have control of, like, why is it that they don't seem to be in control of various places where prices are fluctuating frequently and quickly? Why is it that they get to print out trillions of dollars for their wars and other means? And And I think through this sort of contemplation, people can start to see that their node isn't necessarily giving them the truth that they want. Whereas once you start investigating Bitcoin thoroughly and start understanding how the network operates for yourself and everybody else as a protocol, you start to gather the information to be able to rebuild your node correctly and to connect with those who can then give you additional information to fill out your node. And so, and I think like that's really what's going on a much larger metaphysical level at this point in time with the internet in general, is that the internet's this extremely radical force that I think is deeply underappreciated, just because of how sort of ludicrous we've made the whole thing. But at the base of it, we have this you and me, we've never met, have never been present with each other, have no connection beyond Bitcoin. And yet here we are having a conversation about spirituality, and it's all facilitated by the internet. And I think that is so powerful and important, because now in this process of self-seeking towards truth, we're not just limited to the books on our shelves or the people immediately available, but we can truly strike out on our own to seek out what really are those deepest core truths in the world. And for me, a large part of my journey is I knew from quite early on, and from my experience at Occupy, that something with money was deeply broken. But it wasn't until I started doing all of my own investigations into Bitcoin, and most importantly, connecting with other Bitcoiners, that I started to really understand for myself that this is a much, much greater issue at hand. Like, this isn't actually about money, but it's about the commonality of wealth itself, and what that means in our fallen world, where individuals of the state have taken the full purview onto themselves to control all wealth everywhere for all means. And when you start to understand stuff in that way, I think you can understand, okay, that not only is there something not true about this world, but there's something maniacal in the way that these falsehoods have grappled on to ideas and concepts and overwhelmed and overtaken them for themselves. And I think fiat money is the place that we see that in its most radicalized form. And it makes sense to me that, it would show up as this object that inherently also has other emotions, such as this very deep greed that can be so consuming for individuals that it can allow for the truth to get lost behind their own desires.
And this greed, I think, comes from insecurity and fear, which is so
absolutely
deeply rooted in today's society. It's more like a survival mechanism, because things are so scary here.
I don't think that there are people out there who are like, "Mwahaha," like I can maniacally gather all of the money for myself. I actually think that some of the most wealthy people are individuals who are the most terrified. And I think that through the interaction of the state and taxation, I think that there's almost this paranoid schizophrenia that people have, that between the way that the state attacks wealthy people to steal a portion of their wealth, in addition to the way that inflation operates in the world, I feel like individuals who have larger amounts of wealth, the only way that they can approach the problem is through this sort of paranoid schizophrenia that has them always trying to gather more, like always trying to create another scheme to protect their wealth. And it's really sad, because I think like this is part of what you produce when there is no longer a vehicle that's a stable storage of wealth for individuals, because they can only respond with that extremely deep fear. And that's just a huge product of how I would say most people operate out in the world. And it's really, I find it to be a very, very painful experience to connect with that, because it really hurts me to see how damaging that sort of psychological viewpoint has been to people, and their inability to approach the truth more radically because of how much fear comes up for people.
Yeah, I think fear it's a big reason to the state of society today. It's like so all pervasive, and it's just showing up in different ways. And part of the spiritual practice is sort of to separate yourself from the fear and to see it as something external. But in mainstream society, it's more like you identify with the fear. So then you take it on and you hold on to it, and you think that fear will help you along your journey, but it will actually make you more confused and worried, and you make some crazy decisions because of it.
Yeah, and I think I really appreciate Bitcoin's market cycles because of the way that it forces you to approach that fear. And I think, in the big drop that we saw over the weekend, I think that there's been a lot of people that maybe it calls into question their faith around this or what they're doing. Or I think it brings up tons of really deep fear, particularly around money, which I think is, the largest and the most powerful controlling object for most people. And I think it's really important to try to stay focused on, what is it that one really wants to achieve with Bitcoin? Like if its number go up and get rich, well, I'd really advise, particularly in an environment like this, there's probably going to be some other places and methods to just, stack more fiat money. But if one really wants to look out into the world and be mature about what's going on, like, yes, it can be very fearful, but to me, the response to that fear, particularly before having Bitcoin, was, to collapse into it. There was nothing to be done about any of it. It was, try to cling to the sailboat as desperately as you can and hope that you don't get flung off. Whereas now with Bitcoin and seeing what's going on in the world, while I still remain very fearful about what's going on, to me, what's going on looks very similar to Germany in the early 1920s. It isn't a world that I look out into and feel confident about. But with that being said, when I can move past the fear and the anxiety that produces, I realize that this is an issue of such extreme importance that not only does it merge up with a spiritual idea in idealization, but it has a very deep reality of that. If we don't deal with this money problem for ourselves and our children, I'm forcing that fear and anxiety onto my children in a much more extreme way than even I'm dealing with. And I have a lot of resentment towards my parents' generation for the way that I feel like they gave us this problem because they didn't want to deal with the political consequence of what it meant to deal with. And it's not to blame them, but it's to say, this isn't a problem that has any resolution that can be relegated to anyone else. And so for me, moving past the fear is realizing, yeah, like maybe I lose money. Maybe I'm upside down for a while. Maybe I don't have the ability to spend my savings as soon as I want. But when I move past that and look at it at a deeper level, I can say, you know what? The money system is horrendously broken. It's utilized to create perpetual and infinite wars against innocent people who I feel zealously committed to making sure that I have nothing to do with them being hurt and wronged, as my parents' generation and my grandparents' generation was thoughtless enough to push onto those people. And so it's finally time to actually say, no, we need a money system that works for everybody and not just for the global West, not just for the imperialist nations of the first world, but for everybody, and for the rules around that to be fair. And if it means that we have market volatility and difficulties at time, so be it. Because I feel radically committed to the idea of a global, fair, censorship-resistant digital money that anybody anywhere can freely access if they have the intellectual scaffolding to do that. And I think almost anybody can do that. There's a handful of individuals who might have disabilities or disadvantages that would make that accessibility not possible, but I feel confident that we'll bridge that gap in the coming years. Yeah, I just think it's really important to realize that the fear is very real. But when we allow for that to control our conduct, not only is it very confusing, but it also it steals from our own spiritual empowerment around our confidence and ability to address the issue in a thoughtful and meaningful way, as opposed to an anxious and fearful one.
Yeah, I completely resonate with your message, and this is what I picked up from you in other podcasts also, and that you are this fierce warrior for like the good side, for what I see is the good side when we have self-expression, self-sovereignty, and I consider myself also as I'm all in Bitcoin, and I'm all in on my soul. Like, so I try to follow my soul in every step of the way. And that's why my way to be a warrior. It's like, I believe that this Bitcoin network will help us. And I believe that our souls will be able to guide us to a positive future. And so I'm all in. And I agree with you that it's no time anymore like our parents' generation to just cozy up on the couch and eat some chips and watch some TV. Like, that time is over. Like, this is serious stuff that we need to shape up this world for our children.
Yeah, and I'd also point out that, like, sitting on the TV eating chips, like it's a shitty experience. It like actually sucks. And I think that if most of us take the time to really consider that for a minute, we realize that it's not something that's healing or helpful or really even fun. It's just sort of another one of the many modes of fiat society to grapple onto our time and fill us up with a bunch of vacancy so that we can also go out into the world and be vacant. And and I don't want to take away from, we can still have enjoyment and go out and have fun, but we need to take what's occurring very seriously. And what I've seen, in the development over the past 5 years within Bitcoin is really incredible to see how many people have showed up for that explicit mission. And I see it shine through so much more in markets like this, because we don't have to deal with all the noise of shitcoinery and crypto projects and whatever else is going on. This is one of the places that I feel compromised, is because on one hand, I think shitcoining is sort of the original sin of Bitcoin. Like, it turns out if a man figures out how to create a global digital money from, ex nihilo, that everyone else and their mom on the planet is going to hop on with trying to do the same thing, which is going to cause for the whole cataclysm that's going on. But with that being said, like, I think it's actually a really positive thing. Like, more so today than at any point in time, people are really forced to try to understand the difference between crypto and Bitcoin, which to me, like, I don't want to say that there aren't other valuable or interesting crypto projects. It's that they all need to face the same level of scrutiny that Bitcoin has. And I don't think any projects meet the merit or the ability to withstand that same sort of scrutiny as Bitcoin. It doesn't mean that it isn't possible for them to come up and to be valuable in other regards. But if people are approaching this space as Bitcoin and crypto are the same thing, well, the truth is that they're doing the same thing as our parents' generation of sitting down and turning on the TV to watch chips. And they're just letting that information be pushed into them, so that I always just feel really frustrated when I meet crypto people. And they're like, yeah, I like Bitcoin, but have you heard about my shitcoin? And I'm like, look, like, I don't care about your shitcoin. I think it's a waste of time. I think you're going to lose a bunch of money. And I think a bunch of people are going to get hurt being invested in this, because you're not looking at the core aspects of what this protocol is, because most of the time it turns out that it's just a VC shitcoin project. They give themselves a 70% pre-mine. They give that to all of their friends. They pump it up, say all of these things that are really great about it and how it's going to do all this stuff that Bitcoin can't do. lo and behold, it turns out 5 years later that none of that stuff was true. Somebody's lost a lot of their money. And the saddest part that I see come out of all of this is then they throw the baby out with the bathwater. They go, well, if crypto is a scam, Bitcoin must be a scam too, because it was the first one. And again, with returning to why we need to think hard and considerate about what's going on, is because what's going on is really, really important. And I think it's really funny that Bitcoin presents itself as this, monetary and financial issue when it's not at all. It's actually about the truth of what it means to be a human in the world today, and why we must have a self-sovereign money that is outside and beyond the control of any single nation state. And it's because what's going on in the world is very, very dark. And if we as a globalized humanity don't maturely approach that problem and address it in a thoughtful way, it's going to be a very, very dark future. And I'd also highlight that darkness becomes increasingly so in our particular future with what I like to refer to as the internet and the digital as being this sort of hyper technology, that it's speeding up and it's becoming much more powerful. And so the prospect of a totalizing digital panopticon that can surveil and monitor everyone all the time is a very real and increasing possibility. And Bitcoin's one of the very few ways that we can deal with that in a thoughtful and mature way, in my opinion.
I'm still in my analogy of the human soul being a node, and then you said that the node can be taken over. I said deactivated. And when they are taken over, as you said, I compare this to shitcoins. So you come into the crypto market and then you don't get it. So you connect with some other coin. And this is similar in a society as they get hooked on some political party or philosophy or religion or whatever. And it just feels to me like all those options, all those shitcoins in society that are trying to pull people in and pull them away from their center, pull them away from their own soul, their own voice, that similar to shitcoins, they are... I lost my train of thoughts. So...
No, don't worry. But I think I know where you're going, is that like shitcoining is almost this like all of the alienated apora of society in a lot of ways is shitcoining. All of the things from outside of you that are these inauthentic ideas of that, you need X, Y, or Z to be able to fulfill yourself. And I think that at the base level, there's this same sort of appeal to fear that shitcoining wants through its modeling of Bitcoin, saying that, well, you missed the Bitcoin boat, but you could get on this shitcoin boat that might be able to catch up to Bitcoin. And the saddest thing is that it utilizes that fear in order to be able to attach onto people and sell them on it. And so, whether it's somebody's favorite TV show or the cereal that we need to eat at the store or any of these other things, they're these sort of alienated aporas that are using fear and these sort of external motives to try to latch on to us, as opposed to being able to just give us, the truth as it is, and asking for us to have the self-responsibility and self-sovereignty to maturely deal with that. And I think that this is why we've also seen a lot of inflections in the Bitcoin community towards, like individuals eating more raw or eating higher contents of meat and what meat can bring to you, but also being very highly skeptical of COVID and other things. And I think that this is all part of a community that is engaged in a deeper sense of truth seeking. And I think that that's really important because, the fiatism of general life today is very, very loud and very, very powerful. And if you don't have a method of approaching the world to overcome that, it's very, very easy to get lost and absorbed in it in such a way that it's really like being plugged into the matrix. You have a very hard time understanding why it's problematic.
Can you describe your method how to, do you have like a specific method or system that you come up with how to find truth in things?
I would really say a lot of it is just deep consideration. Like my whole approach to Bitcoin was I don't know or understand any of this. Like my background isn't in software engineering. Like I've built websites and I did all that stuff in the 90s, so I had some rudimentary understanding of it. But one of my biggest places was really admitting from the start that I have no idea what's going on here. And so really asking myself to create the scaffolding and framework for myself around, well, how can I know and understand what to do with this? And I feel extremely fortunate that we live in our day and age, as I'm a pretty curious person. And, I don't believe that I'm a terribly smart individual. I'm not going to say I'm dumb, but I definitely don't like moving into situations with a belief that I know best or understand better. I actually think moving into things with a lot of hesitancy and questioning, while it can mean I don't move fast in things necessarily, it does allow for me to be more thorough about things. And so I think living in this day and age, I can use the internet to look up almost anything that I want and approach it in a meaningful way. And so for me, with knowing nothing about Bitcoin, I was able to, sort of go through what is cryptography, how does it work? Why does it work this way? How is asymmetric cryptography different from normal cryptographic systems? Like, what's the history of all of this? And on and on. And I really felt like it took me the better part of a decade of just reading and research and trying to understand what was going on here to actually start getting some formulation of the truth in a meaningful way. And now I see that pushes out into my life on my own. And a good example is the property I moved out to recently had, that I moved out to last year, has trees all over it, and a lot of them are dead, and I needed to cut a lot of them down, but I'd never used a chainsaw. I don't know how that operates or what goes into felling a tree, but thankfully I had the internet. I could look it up, different techniques. Why does my chainsaw need to be sharp? How long does my bar need to be? How powerful does it need to be? All of these things. And so by the end of the year, because I was able to be curious and continue to gather all of this information, look at different techniques, I can now quite easily go out in my yard, cut down a tree, feel comfortable with cutting it up and splitting it up and doing all those things. And that was only because I could say, hey, I don't know what to do here. I'm not an expert in any of this stuff or how to approach it. And I think the same thing goes for Bitcoin, but it's a much more difficult space because so few of us have any scaffolding at all around money. Growing up, I grew up in a very poor household, and we never spoke about money at any point in time. And trying to bring it up was always sort of an insulting and strange conversation. So I realized as soon as I started kind of reading about economics and Bitcoin and trying to understand how all this stuff works, I realized pretty quickly, I don't know any of this. So I sort of had to go back to the drawing board and, read Austrian economics and compare it to Keynesianism and understand the fine critiques of Keynesian within it to try to overcome that. And I think that that's a really important process for everybody, is admitting what you don't know. And I think that that's one of the more fascinating things about Bitcoin is everyone who approaches Bitcoin has to humble themselves enough to say, I don't know what's going on here. And I really need to fill in the gaps for myself about that. And I forgot who wrote it, but there was a great piece about like how yuppies were going to pass up on Bitcoin because of the way that they believe they already know what finance and all of this stuff is, when the truth is that that's just their own ego and hubris approaching it. So I guess I'd say my method for trying to more deeply understand stuff is to really try to set aside my ego and approach it as if I don't know anything about it, and really build from there, so that by the end of that approach, I can say, you know what, when I first approached this, I didn't know anything. I don't necessarily think I know a whole lot more at this point in time, but I've found other experts and individuals who I can trust and lean on and take their information and combine it with my own understanding to approach this in a more thoughtful way. So I think that's really the key.
Yeah, maybe it was Bitcoin Croesus that wrote that article about the yuppies.
Yes, I do think I think that might have been it. I'm pretty sure it was published in 21 or in Citadel 21 a few years ago.
Yeah. So you mentioned in some podcast that you're planning to create a type of retreat place for self-reflection with psychedelics. Can you tell us about how you started working with psychedelics and how your understanding of yourself, Bitcoin, and the world has changed since you started with this?
So my first approach towards psychedelics was I was aware of how the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous had used LSD specifically to help treat his alcoholism. And I was also aware that like his experiences with using LSD kind of took him to a place that really set him in deep conflict with the rest of the board for Alcoholics Anonymous, so much so that he was asked to leave. And when I read that, I was like, oh, this must be like a pretty powerful tool if that's what he had. Because I had a lot of problems with alcoholism and drinking. And for several years there, I was totally dry. I'll have a drink or two here or there now just because it helps me feel like it doesn't have as much power over me. But so I approached psychedelics because I was struggling so much with alcoholism. And after having my first couple real deep experiences with it, it really healed me in a very special and specific way. And for me, I think the most important thing was having this sort of transcendental awakening of realizing that like this material world is not what we think it is at all. And that not only was a really powerful experience, but it was deeply relieving. And I didn't realize how much tension I had held in myself my entire life around having these deep atheist and agnostic beliefs at the time. Yeah, it was just deeply powerful and healing to have and feel that experience. And it's interesting because it's really helped my understanding with Bitcoin through this method of showing me that things aren't necessarily what they seem like on their surface, and that only with like deep kind of curiosity and inquiry that we can start to understand more deeply what's presented in things. And experimenting with psychedelics has given me a lot more spiritual ease with understanding the sort of thrownness of how things show up in the world in terms of things might seem kind of ridiculous or slapstick in the way that they manifest in the world. And that doesn't need to detract from the seriousness that it is, but it's just, I'm not sure how to really say it other than it informed my own personal philosophy of the world of essentially like this world has to operate through secrets in order to allow for individuals to unveil those secrets for themselves and to have their own personal understanding of how the world works. And so for me with psychedelics, getting to have this experience of a totally different realm where I felt like all of the secrets of life were hidden in everything, everywhere, and that you suddenly became radically present to that, really helped inform me, that I think what's going on with Bitcoin and all of this is pretty similar to it. And furthermore, I also think that coming to a deep understanding of Bitcoin, in my opinion, is very much like a deep psychedelic trip because everything starts to sort of transform around this ideal in a way that's very unexpected and quite radical because now you're seeing very different things than you originally thought you were seeing.
So you consider what you see in a trip to be real, or did you used to think it was more hallucinations? Because I think in the beginning, most people think, oh, it's just hallucination because we are so used to the mainstream world, right? And then if we go into this other realm, we first treat it as some like dream, not real. Or did you have this point where, oh, this is actually, I'm sort of tapping into a deeper layer of reality here? Have you gone through something like that?
Yeah, and I felt lucky that because of my approach towards my first trips and keeping them in a tight container and really approaching them from a deeper spiritual way, that when I first started to tap into that reality, I was aware that it was just that. It was a different and deeper sort of reality behind the veil as opposed to a hallucination. And for me, that was really deeply relieving, and continues to be really deeply relieving, because from my experience tripping, that's like a direct transcendental connection to God. And that's why when I'm in that state, I can feel like I can connect and find that in anything. And for me, it's really meaningful to always know that that's a space that's sort of reserved, that I can always return to. Because for me, it's just it's getting myself much more present to what the truth is, and I can just sort of sit and saturate in that, because as we know from neurological studies around people that are tripping, we know that the conscious mind quiets down quite a bit when one's tripping. And so for me, that experience of my mind quieting down and allowing for the apport of reality to more deeply come into me, in my opinion, allows for me to see past the veil in a way that allows for me to steep in that. But to me, I feel like it's almost like I have the decryption key, like for how to really see reality. And to me, like, it's always like I'm always laughing and having a lot of fun when I'm tripping, because like I feel like with that decryption key that lets me see the actuality of reality, that like I think God's like a really, really funny manifestation, and like that's how he communicates. It's like all through these sort of slapstick jokes that he puts out in the world that are combinations of these contradictions, which for me comes back to full presence of like how hilarious it is that God puts this thing out in the world that he's like, hey, check it out, like, look, it's internet money. And I'm like, oh, actually, like, it turns out that like this is a spiritual reformation that's like built around a kind of technology that's allowing for you to return to truth. But I'm going to give it to you as this, pretty surface level thing that a lot of people would see as being just money. And that, I think that that's what God's love is it's, and it's not because he wants to trick us or anything. It's just, he understands that that's the way he has to communicate to us for us to actually get it. So for me, it's been really healing, and it's allowed for me, I got my alcoholism under control. And I think it's that's really important, because that's a disease that really can eat up people really quickly. And it's I've seen it destroy a number of people. And so I feel so lucky and blessed that I was able to find that for myself and allow for myself to heal through that.
So it sounds like you see God as something separate from yourself. I tend to see it more as God is decentralized. So we are all equal parts of the God network, similar to Bitcoin network. And then like Satoshi was able to create like an imitation of God, because he was able to make pure decentralization. But
yes, and I agree with your statement of I see God that way as well. I think I'm just not as articulate towards it, in addition to just my own Western influences around the idea of, quote unquote, this God person. But yes, I think I very much believe God is also this, it's like a decentralized substance that is the radical truth of our world and existence that can be unveiled sort of secretly to any of us to come to understand in our own way.
Yeah, it's like a decentralized collective where no one can sort of stand above. Like I cannot imagine a Satoshi of the creation network, because of course the Bitcoin network was created by Nakamoto Satoshi, but the creation is like, do we have a God that created this decentralized creation with all the nodes of the souls, or did we create ourselves? And that's, I guess, it's the difference if we are a product or if we are just what we are.
Indeed, and I think that particularly that contemplation in this day and age, I've been reading a lot of Heidegger lately, and a line of his that's really stuck with me is that in our post-nihilistic world, where God has been dead for more than a century now, like it turns out that like in this reality that God needs us more than we need God at this point in time. And I think that that's an interesting idea because in my opinion, God needed Satoshi. He needed to give the revelation of Bitcoin to Satoshi in order for him to push that out into the world. Because, for me, like I don't see a thoughtful methodology of how we overcome a lot of the darkness of global fiatism in our world today without something like Bitcoin. And so to me, like all of the technology and techniques that were integrated into Bitcoin pretty much existed before 2004. So the potentiality to sort of put those pieces together as Satoshi did was always there, but it just happened to so be him who it was revealed to. And so I think, like that's, in my opinion, that's part of God's sort of decentralized way that he operates in the world, is that he reveals his secrets of how the world works to particular individuals in particular ways so that they can go off and do his task in the world. And for me at this point in time, like that's what's going on for many of us with Bitcoin, is that we have done the work to understand Bitcoin in this deeper and more radical way. And because we understand it in that way, we now have a responsibility to go share that with other people and why we feel that way. And sort of how this is all this, decentralized network of value, and to really contest and debate with people. Well, what is this value? What is going on? Is it possible for us to have a mistake here? And I'm open to all of these things. I always think it's funny anytime that I get into these deeper spaces of dialogue with people, I always come out feeling all the more confident and assured about sort of what we're trying to do here. And it's really wonderful. It's very healing too, particularly in a world that feels so wrought with reasonlessness and that has deep nihilism about it.
Yeah, and it brings me into the next area here. From your article, Cryptosovereignty, you write about veritas non auctoritas facit legem, which means truth, not authority, makes legitimacy. And so if we imagine a world that would get rid of authority, then we would sort of collapse into something, right? And if we didn't have Bitcoin, this is like in old Egypt, you had the old kingdom, and then you had the collapse of everything. It was just anarchy and chaos, and it was worse. And then you had the Middle Kingdom. Then again, they got structure, they got a strong king, and they sort of have harmony, centralized harmony. But so the anarchy, the chaos was very bad at that time, because everyone was just sort of sinking to the worst behaviors of survival. But the difference now is, if we would actually just get rid of the man-made rules and structures, we have something else that could carry society, and maybe it doesn't have to go into chaos. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think that that quote specifically, truth not authority creates legitimacy, is an inversion of a dictum from Thomas Hobbes, who he wrote Leviathan in 1648. And Leviathan is widely regarded sort of as the first real political treatise on statecraft as we understand it, with a Westphalian state. And he puts that phrase near the end where he's sort of surmising what the real power of the sovereign is, and that the sovereign's truest power is authority, and his ability to use authority to override any sort of form of truth. And I think that that's a great summary of what we have seen in the world over the past, 400 years, is that through the centralization of the state and the radical authority that we've given it, it's been able to keep a sort of, it's allowed for all of the industrial and technological development. Well, I guess I'd say first, it allowed for the industrial development all the way up to the interwar period. And then in my mind, World War I and World War II was this deep crisis of statism that eventually arrived at the end of World War II, its various genocides and, this huge amount of mechanized killing and total destruction that then evolved into the technological hyper-paranoid state, which developed cryptography for us in the way that it did. And I think through this sort of radical authoritarianism, we have gotten some very, very powerful tools, but it's also clear that it's now in a phase of eating itself in a way that could only be called existential, because with both nuclear proliferation, the way that we're seeing radical changes to climate, the amount of endemic pollution and the way that it's starting to threaten the general biome of the world, we're at a very extreme crisis point where authoritarianism can no longer solve these problems. And it's because we've gotten so deep into the authoritarianism that people aren't actually thinking anymore. The sort of thinking that people do is this grappling on to various pieces of information and trying to shove that into a puzzle, as opposed to approaching things from a first principles orientation to try to address the issue. And so I think that that's one thing that Bitcoiners have done, is because we've sort of disposed of the authoritarianism of money, that's allowed for us to look at it in a much more objective way. That's allowed for us to see, there's this very real problem that has evolved out of the authoritarianism of fiat money. And the inherent lie that is at the bottom, that is a true mathematical accounting error that allows for the fiat system to fully function. And so I think when we start really being able to move away from authoritarianism as a form of legitimacy and start moving back towards truth as the prerogative within legitimacy, a whole new world starts to unveil itself. And I think around the example of Bitcoin, one of the places that I think that this is the most important is when we look at Bitcoin's proof of work and the way that proof of work is utilizing energy. A lot of detractors are saying, no, this is wasting energy. You're taking energy away and using it to create this silly Bitcoin thing that when we have a great financial system. And they're only really doing a surface level approach of it. They're just looking at how much energy Bitcoin's using. They're not looking at where the sources of energy are coming, or how it's being generated, or contrasting that against how much energy is being used by financial servers and this huge network. And so to me, moving away from authoritarianism is the absolute key insight that returns us to sovereignty, because that's the place of real self-sovereignty, is when we no longer say, I'm not going to listen to an authority because I think they're legitimate. I'm going to listen to the truth of what has to be said because of that legitimacy. And whether that comes from a source of authority or from somewhere else, it doesn't matter, because the approach has been corrected. We're utilizing truth as the preeminent form for legitimacy as opposed to authority. And I appreciate that you picked up on that phrase, because that's a really key aspect of a lot of my writings, and how I've really approached sovereignty is from inverting that dictum and saying, if we can move in this world where we utilize truth as our first and foremost function, well, how does that integrate into money? And that sort of ties the Bitcoin into that equation in a very meaningful way, in my opinion.
Yeah, and maybe this could be the difference between the dark ages or the light ages, because every time the centralization have collapsed in the past, the world or that region went into the dark ages because nothing could hold people accountable. So, and if we see it as patterns, of fear, as we talked about, fear and greed, so these patterns become even amplified because they don't have anything holding them to a higher standard. And what we have now with Bitcoin, and it might be this thing that can actually bring out the good things in people, because if we think about the nodes again, I'm going on and on about this, but when we align with our nodes, we start to do really good stuff, and we start to act in alignment with truth. And I think that Bitcoin is sort of could be that missing piece that helps people to connect with their nodes, so they will be good and act good and acting in harmony with other people on the planet. Because this has not happened before. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, and I would agree with that. And I think what's so fascinating is, instead of us sort of descending into the dark ages here, we have an opportunity to ascend into a light age, and I think that part of that is because now that our nodes are connected up and receiving truth, and the way that that truth inflects upon us and influences us is this really powerful and thoughtful methodology that essentially helps us get closer to meaning in the world. And through that approach towards meaning, we're able to more adequately put ourselves out into the world and interact with it in a way that's beneficial to everybody, because I don't have to engage you with suspicion and with the possibility that you could lie or cheat or steal from me. And even though I'm now using this nascent decentralized protocol that's rule bound as opposed to ruler bound, we're able to utilize that as our coordinating shilling point, which I actually think is going to make things a lot better. And I'm already seeing small rhizomes of it in my own space, and that I live in a small local community, and I've already developed a number of relationships where I'm paying people in Bitcoin, and they really like that because that's something they can do off the books, and that they have the advantage of knowing that, we don't have to bring the third party of a government in to help coordinate us. And so I think that maybe as we lose all of the sapora of the centralized state, that individuals are going to create the tools and mechanisms for themselves to be able to help each other. And essentially, in the coming collapse, while it's still going to be fraught with all kinds of issues, I think that in between, people are going to be able to rise up and coordinate in a much more meaningful way than we have in other collapse events, because we have this coordinating mechanism. Yeah, and it's really exciting, because I think even more so than all of this sort of surface level, hey, we have this great money that can't be inflated, we can save better, that this has really deep and profound meaning for what it means to be a human. That I can now save for my children's future in a meaningful way, that I don't have to have this sort of schizophrenic paranoia of trying to save and gather as much money as I can to try to beat the melting ice cube of inflation or taxation. But all of this, it opens us up to a more meaningful form of life, because we don't have to obsess about money. We don't have to make making money our primary point in our life. And this can allow for us to return to a much more meaningful way of being, so that as we're saving money, I think even after this precipitous drop, it makes me really happy that, I still have the same amount of Bitcoin, and I feel secure about that. And furthermore, there's actually a great opportunity if I can, get my ass in gear and, get to selling some of my wares and other things and having my business in order. Well, I can increase my cash flow and stack more and save more for the future. It really warms my heart to think about, an individual like you who's halfway around the planet, and we don't know much about each other than that we're both Bitcoiners, but we can sit down and have a thoughtful communication that I think can deepen both of us in a meaningful way. And I think that that's not available in a lot of spaces in the world today. At least there's a lot of probing that sort of needs to happen before we can just kind of drop right into it. So
Absolutely. I also want to dive into a topic which is sort of between spirituality and Bitcoiners, and it's something like sometimes I don't know like what's the best way, and it's something that separates spiritual teachings maybe from Bitcoiners' way of life, and this is about force and how to use force. So you wrote in your piece, I hope I don't misquote this, but crypto creates a novel new form of sovereignty through cryptographic systems, which do not need any form of physical force to support them, just the code alone. You also talk about in the article, like before it was centralization, and then it was some kind of war that pushed away the controllers, but then they become new controllers because they were coming from a place of force. So if it's always force replacing force, then it's always sort of the same system going on. But like you say here, the cryptographic systems like Bitcoin, then that we are able to find this higher level of society when we are not based in force, but we are based out of just being, I guess, being and yet, or love, you can say. And this is something that decentralization of money could bring in, and it's not force going on. And then you have with Gandhi, he didn't use force to take out the Great Britain out of India. He was stood up for what he believed in, and he was able to win that war without fighting anything, like non-violence, right?
And then I'm sure you know of the term that Gandhi utilized to fight. What the term of Sagradya?
Mm-hmm.
And Sagradya means, standing firmly in the truth, and that's he was truth speaking in a radical way. And I think that's very similar to what Bitcoin is doing. And it's doing it through this non-violent method that's been organized. And how, for me, and this is what my piece Bitcoin is Messianic is about, is that I truly believe that the radical non-violent force that is Bitcoin, when juxtaposed against the radical violence that all fiat money must be, like that is Messianic in my opinion, because we have now initiated a methodology to steadfastly stand in the truth and contrast that against the radical unholy mechanization of violence vis-a-vis the state and fiat money, and that's very powerful. And I have a number of places that I've spoken to, but I'm an anti-war activist. I don't think war ever benefits anybody ever. I think it's always horrific killing that brings people to the table because the suffering is so great and barbaric that they don't want it anymore. And that's such a terrible and horrific way any of us should ever have to deal with the world. And so for me, one of the largest things about Bitcoin is I am a radically nonviolent, I'm radically committed to nonviolence. So much so that I would much rather put all of my wealth inside of a system that I know can't be compromised and utilized for violence, and take on the risk of the possibility of it all evaporating or being destroyed, than wanting to have anything to do with the system of force and violence that is the American dollar, and it's only from my experiences of traveling through Southeast Asia and a lot of poor war-torn countries that were, nearly bombed out of existence by Americans, that I really understood my responsibility of that I must do everything in my power to help end this fiat system, for the sole reason of that I no longer want to finance the tyrannical and horrific wars that have killed tens of millions of people throughout the 20th century because of the capacity of fiat money to finance that. For me, that is the most important thing that is happening here. And for me, that is a deeply spiritual path, because I don't want anything to do with a system of force, to be clear, all systems of fiat money are systems of force. And I think it's really important to highlight and underline that, because there is no way to have a fiat monetary system that operates without force.
Yeah, I just think it's a thin line when standing in truth, and then we have the Bitcoin, the toxic Bitcoin maximalisms that can sometimes almost come over the border of be a force, like, and sometimes it's like, okay, are we now fighting force with force again? Is it another kind of similar pattern from before? Have you ever thought about that?
About Bitcoin toxicity as being force?
Yeah, like sometimes it's can be seen. I'm not saying it is, and this is sort of what I'm bringing up here, because also this quote, you have this evil thrive only when good people do nothing, right? So you have this, and you have Jesus talking about turn the other cheek, but then also he goes and you know, screams at the shitcoiners in the marketplace. So I think it's this: what is force, and when do you stand in truth, and what is the fine line? Like what should we try to avoid to not repeat the history and create another Bitcoin force?
To me, it's the non-physicality that really has to be the reserving point. And I think that's why Satoshi is an anon, and why we've had other anons such as, you know, Shao and Fry come in and help with protocol development where we need to, is that ability for people to have the non-physical realm reserved for themselves to remain non-physical, and for the inability to have physical violence find themselves. But I think that's interesting when we contrast against the force of truth of, you know, toxic maximalists standing up and saying, you know, this shitcoin is bad. And I oscillate on it because, like, you know, like I'm like a pretty friendly guy. Like I want to get along well with people and have them feel good and included. And, you know, like like pre-Bitcoin, I wanted to be a therapist, you know, and help talk about people's feelings and that stuff. So like I sometimes don't want to be toxic and, you know, to try to be nice, but at the same time, on the other side, like I do want to scream at these people and go, you guys with your shitcoinery are fucking all of this up. Like, we could be well on our way towards a more hyper Bitcoinized world, but because you guys are confusing people with the lies and shitcoining and trying to obfuscate crypto and Bitcoin, you're making this more difficult. I don't want to say that to them to be mean, but I really want to presence them to the reality of, all, like, this is a fucking cash grab for you guys. And you and I both know it, because when you go to talk about what you're doing, it is all this superfluous bullshit, versus what Bitcoiners are saying is that we want to change money to make it decentralized, global, fair, and for everybody, as opposed to, you know, whatever you're trying to do with your shitcoin token. And one of the things I find the most interesting is so frequently the conversation with shitcoiners are about the possibilities and promises that their system can do versus the reality of what Bitcoin is doing right now. And so I think that that's one of those interesting ways we can get ourselves to return to truth. And again, the sort of forcefulness of the conversation that Toxic Maximus brings up, I don't think has a relationship towards the physical violence that is deeply ingrained within fiat culture. And I actually think it's really interesting to sort of contrast in that way, because like a toxic Bitcoin maximalist can be really mean and inflammatory and say hurtful things, but it's all non-physical. Like, there's never a point in time that it does get physical.
We have come to the end with the time here. So I want to thank you very much for taking the time this Thursday morning.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the conversation, and I appreciate that they're trying to get individuals that are more spiritually inclined to be looking at Bitcoin, because I think they're some of our greatest allies. And I think that for them having their own light bulb moment around Bitcoin is very important. And I think will usually be a pretty wonderful discovery for them that something like this is out there waiting for them.
Yeah, it's like a gift. If they just would open their mind, but they are. It's a very interesting time we're living in, where you have this. Because for me, it was really like a gift from God in my spiritual path, when I was like, oh my God, it's actually something that's working, and it can work.
Hey man, I'm 100% there. Like I'm at the place that I literally believe God like delivered to this, made me crazy, and I was like, all right, I don't understand all this, but I'm going all in on it, and for that, I feel like God gave me a totally new and different lifestyle for me that wasn't on the table before, and because of that one beautiful gift He gave me, I am His missionary in the world to spread His gospel about the good news of Bitcoin, and doing everything that I can to give it to other people. So that's why I'm here, and that's why I have these conversations.
Like a modern day prophet.
Well, a truth speaker, I would say.
All right. So have a good day, and see you around.
Thank you. And I hope you will make it out to